We continue our conversation on how to be bold, or what bold is, or what bold looks like. We've talked about a lot of different things and a lot of different ways to look at it. And I put a question on the board up here, but I also have what's upcoming. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk what is not being bold next week. What does it look like when we're not being bold? What are ways to not be bold? I am a prime example of ways to not be bold in the way that I sometimes deal with things. I sometimes get a little mouthy. I sometimes get a little angry. And so those are some of the ways. But we're going to talk about those. And I'll use a lot of personal experience next week, so that'll be a lot of fun. You'll learn a lot about Andy next week. Who wants to know that? Nobody, right? And then the following week is how do we put these two verses right behind French's over here on this wall, as to how do we put them into action in our life. And if the Romans 8, verse 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? And Acts 4, verse 31, and now, Lord, look upon the threats and grant to your servants to continue to speak your word with all boldness. How do we actually put them into practice in our life? How do we actually use those in our daily life? And I wanted to spend some time talking about those, but those are the next two. We'll probably come up with an end to our topic after this one. I've only had one suggestion for a topic so far, and so if you have a suggestion for our next ongoing topics, would be great. Most people have said they're happy with the way that we're doing it, or the process that we're doing, but if you have any particular topic that you'd like to study as it comes to maybe our emotional, mental process that we've been doing, please let us know. Are they moving a building? Goodness gracious. And so if you have any topic suggestions on that, please let me know. So far I've had the suggestion of prayer, which I think is a good one, but I would like to get some more suggestions if you have any on topics that we can discuss. I'll let you know if you bring one up that we have already discussed, because we're now like 3 years into this class or so. Is it 3 years? Something like 3 years, right? And so keep that on your mind. Send me an email, send me a text, send me a letter, put it on mail, send it by carrier pigeon. I don't care. All right, so for today, what I wanted to ask are what or who are examples of being bold that you can think of, either from Scripture and sometimes from our personal life. Right? I know we like to use Scripture and we like to talk about Scripture and all the things that happen in Scripture as great examples, and that's true. But how many people have seen great examples of somebody being bold in their lives? Has anybody seen example of people being bold in their lives? Right? Examples of people in their life that were bold, where you just kind of stood back and went, wow. Yeah, a lot of times you'll hear people say, I don't think I could do that. Right? Anybody ever heard that? Right? Some people will say to those that speak or teach, I could never do that. I could never lead a class. I could never do a sermon. I could never lead singing. I could never do this. I could never meet with somebody one-on-one and talk about the gospel or whatever it happens to be. So what are some examples? Let's talk about some examples. This is not preset. I don't have any of them written down. And so this is kind of ideas for you guys to throw at me, is what are some examples of people in your life or scriptural people that you can think of that were bold, acted boldly in some way?
Richard was a pretty bold man. He taught me a lot about being bold in Christ.
Richard. All right. Okay, example maybe that you can give.
He went overseas, multi different places. He taught classes here. He would leave church here and go to the nursing home and teach Bible class there.
So he was bold for the Lord in many ways. Yeah.
Some other stuff he did was pretty bold. He put all the high schools together.
Yes, he sure did.
Lincoln County High School years ago.
Really?
Sure did.
Really? That's bold in the community. Definitely. Not afraid to tackle things, not afraid to approach. Huh?
There's a lot more richer stories than that.
There's so many.
They go in all kinds of different ways, don't they? Yeah.
There's so many.
So Richard's an example in our daily lives. I was lucky enough to meet him before he began his slide and what in his health, and he came to Sunday nights when I was overseeing Sunday nights before, and so he's a good example of that, both in community and in faith, being bold, stepping up. How many of you went to a foreign country and shared the gospel in maybe foreign countries that weren't necessarily faith-friendly worlds? where you actually did put your life on the line to step out and speak boldly. I would assume he did in a couple of areas.
He went over to Russia before all this started, but he was in Russia giving out Bibles and everything.
Excellent example. Thank you. What else?
Jeff Shelton that we used to go to church with, he had been a missionary in the Philippines. When he came back to Tennessee, he wanted to go door knocking. He said, we need to go to our community. And it was in Antioch, Tennessee. And they're like, no, that doesn't work. And he went out and started door knocking. And they finally got one person to open the door. And it was a Laotian man. And from that one person, that church now has a Laotian ministry because the minister there and other people had told him that's not going to work. We've done that, been there, done that, it doesn't work. But he didn't take no for an answer.
And that's an interesting story. We were at Antioch Church of Christ when that happened. Not Antioch, Royal Hill Church of Christ up in Antioch. And the interesting thing about that story is when he retired from preaching, he came over and the church had been supporting him, fully supporting him, so they just continued. And the minister asked him, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to start door knocking this neighborhood behind the church. And the minister told him, door knocking doesn't work anymore. You're not going to get any help. He said, so what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to knock those doors. He went up and down 2 times, knocking every door before he got the first answer. And then he got what turned into Seeds of a Laotian Church ministry. He was told that was not the right way to be bold. He was told, you're wasting your time. He was told it's going to be a fruitless endeavor. And now they run a separate service at that building on a Sunday and on a Wednesday. Some stuff during the week. Because he was willing to be bold. He didn't listen to naysayers. He didn't listen to those who told him he couldn't do it. Anybody have examples of that? Now, you don't have to talk about them, but you have examples where you said, I'm going to try this. And I'm going to do it. Oh, that's never going to work. And people will naysay, and people will say you can't do that. And people will say that's not going to be fruitful. Y'all have examples of that in your life? What else?
On the scripture side,
Elijah.
versus the Jezebel and the priest.
And the Baal, is that the Baal one, or is that, no, that's not the Baal, it's the Baal worshiper.
He's about the only prophet in Israel.
His is an interesting one because no matter what they said, he stood his ground. What's written so far? Right.
All the apostles, except for one, died.
All the apostles, absolutely. Paul.
David.
Right.
That was the one that somebody mentioned this week. We hear about Daniel in the lion's den, but we forget what got him in the lion's den. That he didn't pray even though he knew and the future thing you're about to talk about. That I told him if you keep praying, you can die. Okay,
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego along the same lines of the same time period. They were said, you got to bow. They said, we ain't going to bow.
There's one little lady here, and you don't necessarily think about her being bold because she was a very petite woman, very quiet woman, but it's David Richardson's mother. Miss Effie.
How do you spell Effie?
E-F-F-I-E.
E-F-F-I-E. Okay.
I can tell you there's several individuals that you would never thought about being Christians in the church today. And we're talking third and fourth generation now because of her, but she would set up Bible studies, and she wouldn't necessarily be the one that would conduct them, but she would reach out to different people around her. And we had one time, I think the count was over 20 or 30 different people at that time, not counting families down the road that became followers. But she was one of those, she wasn't what we normally think of bold, and that she was out where everybody could see her, but she...
Is bold always outspoken and loud?
We think about sometimes being out in your face.
Right.
It was one of those that she did it, I won't say undercover, but without being bragging about it, about pushing it out in front of it. And I think that sometimes we forget that in our society, especially today, is who's out there and who's seen the most, who's done the most, who's done this.
It's that
But I realize
quiet.
There's some people underneath the radar they're the ones that make things happen.
Well, the quiet people, they can be as bold as a loud, obnoxious person, right? They can be quiet behind the scenes. Sometimes more things get done by the boldness of the quiet than the brashness and loudness of the others. How about from our lives, mothers? And by certain grandmothers. Dads. Grandparents or grandparents. All right? I want you to think back about how many of you in your genealogy, this was the person that made the difference in your faith. They brought us to church every week. My mother was a bold person. Gets on my nerves sometimes, but she was always a bold person because she brought person after person after person with us when we were growing up. A lot of them were family members, right? I came from the Church of Christ, but that's out of Kentucky, and we lived in Indiana. She came from the Baptist faith when she met my dad. She brought her sisters. She brought her nephews and nieces. She brought cousins. Brought all of them to church with her. To teach them, to bring them, to show them God. My dad shared his faith at work, regardless of whether he was allowed to or not, and brought many people on his lunch breaks. That's what he did, was he shared his faith. He had Bible studies during breaks and lunch hours, working in a factory. And that enabled him to reach, and he brought many people to the faith through being bold in a very quiet sense. My dad is a very quiet person, for the most part. Right? I know parents, dads especially, Sherry's dad, my dad, who have been elders, who were bold in standing up for what they believed in when there were environments around them pushing to move away from Scripture and more towards culturally relevant worship. How many of you have somebody in your life like this? That person may actually be, now don't misunderstand me, God's the reason that you're saved, but the reason that you came in contact with your faith was somebody like this. How about a husband or a wife? That regardless of what the other one said, they kept coming to church. They kept bringing their children to church. They stood their ground when they needed to stand their ground. Do you know how bold that is? Do you know how bold it is to stand up against your spouse and say, I don't care what you think. This is what I have to do. How many of us give credit to that? What else? We wrote quite a few people over here. Ruth, standing beside Naomi, right? Right? Peter, even after his denials. All of the apostles, except for one who gave their life, but really, John gave his life because he was sent to Patmos to die there away from everybody. Right? Paul, David, in all the different ways. Moses, some people think, well, but was Moses bold? Because he kept stepping away. Moses still did what he was asked to do. How about Abraham? How about Abram versus Abraham, right? Could you have done what Abram did? I want you to pick up all your stuff and all your family, and I want you to take them to a land. Where are we going to go? I'll tell you when you get there. How many of you would do that? How many of you would do that? How many would you pick up all your stuff and just go? And that, hey, when you get there, I'll let you know. Abraham did that. Who else?
Esther was one too.
Esther, absolutely.
Abraham was also willing to give up his son in sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. How many of you would do that? All right, we got two beautiful little babies. How many of you would sacrifice your child? See, that's where I don't understand God. Because God sacrificed His Son for us. I will take anybody out over my children. How many parents feel that way? That you would protect no matter what. But God was willing to sacrifice His Son for a group of people that did not treat Him well, did not love God.
And back on the family thing,
Uh-huh.
sometimes it works opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Stepping out to become a Christian and your family's not.
Yeah.
Kind of had to do that. My family started in church young and then fell away. And then when I went back in college and was baptized, I got some flack on it.
Mm-hmm.
So, you
Family can
calls
be hard in criticism too.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
I think one thing we're doing, this is concerning to me, to see what's happened in my lifetime. But you think about Noah bearing the brunt of all the mocking and everything that went on for all the years. Because God told him to do something. And I'm wondering how, you mentioned about culturally acceptable
Mm-hmm.
and how now our boldness is, I say threatened, but we feel like that's not acceptable anymore to be bold about certain things.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting segue into this. And I completely agree that sometimes it's your kids that bring you. Right? Sherry tells a story, I'm going to tell your story if that's okay, of a boy she was dating in high school and how she studied with him. He went to his church, who was not a Church of Christ, and studied with their minister, pastor, whatever, Methodist, whatever it is that whatever the clergy name they use is, and convinced them through study of the Bible. Now, this is a teenage male who was a quiet, introverted kid, right? Convinced that leader that their church needed to start doing communion every Sunday. Talk about the boldness in that, being a teenager. How many of us in this room as a teenager would have the guts to go up to the leadership of the church and convince them that they need to change something about the way they do services? And pull the Bible out and say, you're not following Scripture. You're telling a clergyman who has spent their life probably studying Scripture that they're seeing it wrong. What kind of boldness is that? How many of us could do that? I don't know what happened. Is he ever get married?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
He's been married for a long time.
Okay.
Yeah, he lives around Huntsville somewhere.
I don't know. I've never met him, so he's not my problem. But I think he is a good example of a good example of boldness, being willing to step out and do that. Can you think of in your life an example or a moment where you were bold, whatever the example is, and how you handled it? Do you feel like you handled it in an appropriate boldness? Because like I said, next week we'll talk about what's not being bold, but how did you handle it? You know, I think the interesting thing is a lot of times we step back and we can understand, well, I did this wrong. I did this wrong. I did this wrong. Well, how about the way we did it if we did it maybe right? The appropriate way to handle a situation. Because the question I want to ask about all of these people here and all of these peoples and situations here, and I think the kids and children one's an excellent one, what enabled them to do that?
Andy, I've got another one from the community. The people that started Riverside, they were told that we had to work. They stepped out boldly in that. God blessed them in that. And every year somebody starts the rumor, oh, they're closing, oh, they're closing. In their 22nd year now. But those people that started it gave up a lot to start that.
So what enabled all... Right. I ran out of room.
An example of that.
Sorry, go ahead.
The teenager,
Uh-huh.
what enabled him to is he believed with passion
Mm-hmm.
beyond a shadow of doubt.
So believe.
Strong convictions.
So good. Peyton?
I just want to share from my life. The night when Lauren was on before she passed, makes these mustard seed bracelets.
Mhm.
This is something that she did during her illness.
Mhm.
She was bold enough to minister to the chaplain at the hospital.
Wow.
About her faith and why
Mhm.
she makes what she does, and I just thought that was really, really something.
That is. Even in their moment.
Yeah.
Wow.
You have faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains, he says.
Mm-hmm. You were saying conviction.
Strong conviction.
Strong. No, no, just strong. There you go. It moves you, right? It's what you believe in. How strong is that, Bubba?
I think I'm trying to segue to your next topic, partially, but
Mm-hmm.
is the faith and prayer both? It's a combination.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know about your faith until you start praying, and vice versa. You have the faith to pray to God. You know how people know, have a lot of conversations, every how many years it was, it took
Mhm.
to build that with God. Are you sure I'm doing the right thing?
Mm-hmm.
And God probably said, shut up and keep working. Sometimes we don't hear the shut up and keep working deal. We just, God, I don't want to do this.
I've always determined God doesn't care what I want to do. It's what He wants me to do. I think there's an understanding of what faith is. I think there's an understanding of who God is that God's plan is the best. I look at this over here, and when I think about people like this that we've mentioned, and there's thousands upon thousands of examples, but Romans 8, I think those people really look at it and say, if God is for me, who can be against me? Nothing can stop them because God is on their side. There is an understanding in these people right here that their faith could cause them what? Death, without question. There are people over here that what they were doing could cause them death, major life changes, major things hurting in their life, problems that they will experience and deal with. But they believe, without question, that if God is for them, who can be against us? And then they speak it and go into Acts 4 verse 31. That's kind of the conversation for 2 weeks out is they're going to speak that word with all boldness. Because these people over here, it's not just what they said, but how they lived their life. The example that they were. Their lives themselves were bold. Are you living your life boldly? Are you living in it a way that tells people no matter what's happening that you believe Romans 8:31? That you will stand your ground and you will stand with God and prepare to defend that regardless of what that consequence is. Because it doesn't matter if it's a scriptural, community, or a personal life thing. No matter what you do, the person that you are exempling is who? When you slap the name Christian on your nameplate, who are you an example for in everything that you do? I struggle with remembering that in my life. But that's truth, is it not? That when you say you're a Christian, people double down on waiting for you to screw up. They double down and waiting for you to back off or not stand, just to prove that you really don't believe in that or this Jesus thing is all hokey pokey. All these people that we talked about up here arguably took those 2 verses to heart and exampled that in their life.
There are places in the world you go, if you have the Christian label on you, people want to hurt you badly. I've experienced that in my life.
I told you I told a story about the guy that I worked with that was the Egyptian. That the way they told who other Christians were is when they went to shake hands, they would have a cross tattooed right here on their hand. That is how they could identify other people of faith. Because to boldly, I say it like they're not standing up, but to outrightly come out and say, I am a Christian, and wear a big old hat that says I'm a Christian, what will happen to them? They'll be put to death. And we say, well, they're not living boldly, Andy. Well, Christians of the 1st and 2nd century lived in caves. and went underground, yet they were still considered bold. It's not always standing on the street corner screaming something that is the boldness. Sometimes it's the continuous movement underneath that really speaks to boldness.
It goes along with what Jesus said, not
Mhm.
be lukewarm.
Mm-hmm.
Think about all the examples on the board, or what I'm thinking of, it's when people in your lives are bold, you remember what they stand for.
Mhm.
It helps build your Christian faith. But if we're all lukewarm, you don't remember that.
There's a gentleman out in Park City that stands outside IGA and he holds up a sign
Yep.
and asks everyone,
Yes.
if you believe, honk your horn.
And
Mhm.
I was
Honk my
honking
horn
away.
every time.
Yes.
That's being pretty bold,
And
I
Barkley
think.
asked me, he's like, why does he do that? I said, because
That's his boldness.
that's
Yep.
his boldness. He's feeling really strongly
I
about
talked
it.
about the Presbyterian priest up in Greenfield where I grew up that would stand on the corner during any event that ever happened. You heard that guy one time, didn't you? Any event ever happened in Greenfield, he'd stand on the corner of where his church sat with a speaker and a microphone screaming Jesus at you. Now, I don't know that he was doing it the right way, but that man was bold because everybody made fun of him,
Well, I mean, if you think
including me.
of persons recently, that would be, not to get controversial, Donald Trump,
Hmm.
whether you like him or not. He stood up and said what he thought.
Mhm.
And believed it.
Now, there might be arguments to say that his boldness may not have been directed correctly, but it was still bold.
What we become in our society is, this is kind of what I was getting to earlier. We become our society is not supposed to be
Offensive.
offensive, controversial, or hurt anybody's feelings,
That's not spelled right.
or express your feelings beyond
Mhm.
what their feelings are. And that's it's really been changing 30 years, and it's been less than 30 years, really. I mean, y'all age years in your age group, it's changed.
I think one of the things we're going to talk about as we get down into these is his concept of controversial. Because if you're going to be controversial in today's world, if you're going to be bold in today's world, you are going to be controversial. That doesn't mean you have to be argumentative and difficult, but what you're going to say and do and how you live your life will be controversial. I am well over time. Thank you all very much for your comments today. I have very much enjoyed class. We will hopefully see you next week.